Mark?
For no changes.
So now we have Mark Stevenson regarding any changes to the industrial, no changes to industrial or commercial that were sought by the ministers.
Yep, pages.
Good morning. I'd like to begin on page 155 at the bottom. That relates to recommendation 16, and recommendation 16 was to further reduce the triggers for resource consents, particularly in core commercial areas where a range of activities should be permitted in line with the zoning. I should note that this point is very similar to recommendation 17 on page 158, and so our response to both those recommendations is wrapped up together. The particular aspect of these recommendations that I want to comment on is the thresholds for when an urban design assessment is required. And having considered the comments raised and also considered the statutory context of the Land Use Recovery Plan and the RPS, amongst other matters, it's proposed that there's no change to the thresholds that we have in the proposed plan that has gone to the ministers. As you may recall, we put forward some amendments to the thresholds prior to approval of the draft that went to the ministers, and we feel that there's a need to have that assessment of urban design for larger scale developments where there can be significant impacts on the design and amenity of a commercial centre, and by having council input to the design of new development, we can achieve much greater, higher quality outcomes, not just for the community but for the business owners and occupiers. Buildings that are more attractive potentially yield a greater rental. Buildings that are more attractive potentially attract greater customers. So hence we're not proposing to change those thresholds. That's the first point. And later on I'll come on to talk about some minor amendments we're proposing to the matters of assessment for any resource consent subject to urban design thresholds. The second point I just wanted to touch on that we're not proposing changes to is recommendation 18.18, and that's on page 161. The recommendation is to provide further analysis in the Section 32 report to illustrate the theoretical land supply will ensure suitable and sufficient commercial and industrial sufficient and suitable land for commercial and industrial activities. I paraphrase that. And you'll note on page 162, there's a table that sets out the amount of land that is currently zoned or we're proposing to rezone in the proposed district plan to provide for future commercial growth. And this, in total, 120,000 square metres of floor space that will be provided for across 59 hectares, and that's considered, having regard to the forecast growth in commercial activity, that is considered sufficient to meet that future demand. What's not in this table is other capacity that exists, which exists at present as well. So there's been vacant sites created through demolition in existing commercial areas. There's also greater potential for intensification within existing commercial centres through changes to the rules that were in the version that went to the ministers. Now, in terms of industrial capacity, just referring to page 164 and 165, there's a summary provided there of the greenfield areas identified in the Land Use Recovery Plan, and that identifies that in the recovery plan there's over 400 hectares of industrial land identified. Of that 400 hectares, over 250 hectares could be developed without significant infrastructure upgrades, and any infrastructure improvements required can be undertaken as part of the subdivision process. That greenfield capacity is in addition to the existing industrial areas of the city that we've got. So the existing industrial areas of the city, such as Woolston, Bromley, Blenheim Road, Middleton, having regard to council's data on vacant land, there's in the order of 350 hectares of vacant land. So combining those figures of 250 and 350 hectares, you can clearly see there's more than sufficient land, and we've undertaken an assessment to determine that that land is suitable in terms of greenfield areas, and we've shown in these tables that there is the ability to service 250 hectares in the short term. So as an officer recommendation, we're not proposing a change in terms of adding to the supply, and the tables here demonstrate that there is that supply available. So this will form part of the documents that go forward.
Just so that you understand this in a bit more of a framework, perhaps I could ask Mark to tell you what the average take-up of industrial land has been post-earthquake, and I don't know if we know it, pre-earthquake and then post-earthquake.
Council has, for a number of years, collected data on building consents issued in industrial areas, and assuming that all building consents are implemented, the take-up of industrial land is in the order of 15 to 20 hectares per annum. So if you then extrapolate that out to consider in relation to the supply of land, the vacant land of 350 hectares in our existing industrial areas plus the 250 in greenfield areas, we're talking about in the order of, from memory, 30 years of supply, if not more.
And generally councils are required to review their plans every 10 years.
So can you talk about the LERP requirement that we sort of basically prefer the central city for commercial?
The land use recovery plan has actions around giving primacy to the central city as the destination for a large range of activities. The Chapter 6 of the Regional Policy Statement and the Land Use Recovery Plan, in fact, also direct commercial activity to our larger retail centres, the key activity centres of Riccarton, Shirley, Linwood, and also reference is made to neighbourhood centres as the focal point for those activities. And so in the commercial chapter, we've established a hierarchy of centres. So the central city at the top, and then district centres, followed by neighbourhood centres. And the strategy we're proposing in the commercial chapter is to direct larger scale retail and office developments to the central city, but also to key activity centres. And the future growth that's expected, particularly growth in the southwest, where there's a lot of residential subdivisions occurring, that's proposed to be met by a new key activity centre in North Horswell, but also within existing capacity of centres and including the central city. So in that respect, we're addressing the LERP requirement to ensure there's primacy given to the central city and to key activity centres, but also providing for growth in the smaller centres.
So that's something that the council can't not do. We're directed by government to do that by the LERP.
Yes. That's correct.
Okay, but so then why would the government then say that they were concerned about us not addressing the land supply issue around commercial, industrial and residential? I mean that's the way I read recommendation 18. Have I got that wrong?
My reading of it is that concerned as to whether the take-up of that land will occur, and we're encouraging that take-up by taking a centres-based approach. At the moment, the current city plan provides for and really opens the door for retail and office activity in a number of industrial zones. Now, if we focus those activities in commercial centres, then there should be a greater take-up of land in those centres. The question around whether it's suitable or not, that analysis of industrial land supply has shown that there's infrastructure there to accommodate that growth, and it's really dependent on the landowners, like residential, to then deliver on that. In the case of industrial land supply, we have potentially an oversupply in the short term. In terms of commercial activity, our evidence points to a significant quantum of capacity in the central city, but also in the new centres that we've identified around the city and this district plan review, which enables the rezoning of several new centres, including North Hawesville, will provide that capacity, and that's as far as a council we can go.
Are we monitoring that? Just, I mean, for our own, sort of concern, because, you keep reading stuff in the paper and hearing, people commenting about, potential oversupply of office space and, the floor rates, in different areas, leading to sort of different decisions being made. I'm just worried about, the sort of kind of boomerang effect that you hear about.
The council, unlike industrial land, doesn't maintain a register as such of office floor space, but it's for the purpose of a briefing in April, May, when we provided a memo to you with a summary of the floor space approved in terms of offices in the central city and also suburban areas. We were able to obtain that data very easily. The likes of Colliers and other firms collect that data as part of their everyday business, and that market interface is obviously critical to understanding what's available, and we're confident in the figures we're using to inform how much land we rezone and how much floor space that provides for that. There is sufficient capacity.
It'd be good to have a map of that at some point. I mean, not for this now, but I personally would be very interested in seeing a map around the commercial development. Paul?
You touched on a point. That's exactly what I was going to ask, is around that floor space and the take-up of that floor space. You obviously got information around the industrial take-up, and obviously got 30 years of supply. It'd be really good to understand the commercial sector, because the key concern probably for me is that if the central city takes precedent over all other areas, if you look at pre-earthquake, 85% of the redevelopment of commercial space was actually outside the 4 Avs. So we need to figure out how we can move that back in to actually ensure that we actually get a rebuild, and that we have tenants to go into that rebuild. Otherwise it won't happen. So that is my concern. The allowance of expansion of commercial space and retail space into these suburban key activity centres will lessen the chance of actually getting a rebuild in the central city.
Certainly, we can. The other source that I didn't refer to is our consents data, and larger developments, particularly in our commercial centres, will require resource consent. Particularly with the urban design triggers going forward, there'll be ability to capture the majority of development in terms of monitoring floor space, and that will be a source that we could effectively start monitoring now to have a better picture of where the consented floor space is going.
Phil?
Look, I'm aware on this page that it's clear, and we decided that that mail site is in the next phase. I'm just asking you about the sort of description of commercial activity being within the general industrial designation. Like, it's kind of confusing. It seems that here there is a way of restricting, well, with that area, it will be restricted through some of the rules to commercial. But in fact, the designation is industrial.
Page 163, there's a bullet points on the upper part of that page, and in the context of that paragraph, it's describing where there's also capacity outside of commercial centres, and in industrial zones going forward, the policy direction is to only provide for primarily industrial activity in industrial zones. But there's recognition that there's obviously existing office and retail activity in a number of industrial zones, but the industrial park zone is a proposed zone, and we discussed the Tate campus and providing for a quantum of office floor space up to what we decided on was 5,000 square metres, and so that adds to that supply of where office activity can occur, and subject to discussions about the mail site at a future date. That is also a potential source, or can contribute to the capacity for commercial activities, but because it's a greenfield priority area, like other greenfield priority areas, we have to put in place restrictions on the quantum of office and retail activities in those locations to ensure that they do primarily remain as industrial activities. But this statement about mail is on the assumption of provisions that need to be revisited as part of phase 2. So this isn't by any means putting forward something to go into phase 1. It's really a response to acknowledge that greenfield priority areas do also provide some capacity.
So just for clarity for me, are you really saying too though that this plan is restricted by our council's policies that we have?
The policies in the RPS and in LERP signal that we should only provide for primarily industrial activities in industrial zones, and there's clear policy direction for greenfield areas that approach is taken. So it's not something we've come up with ourselves. It's really reflecting the higher order documents.
Okay.
Yanni?
Thank you.
Yanni?
Thank you. Just on page 29, there's quite a lot of comment from the government over extending this to the central city plan. And
It's 29 in attachment 1.
attachment 1. So I just wanted to understand. My understanding was we'd asked government if we could include the central city in this because of the residential stuff, and they said no, we don't want you to do it. We're going to do it.
No.
Is that
No, what we did was we asked the government whether we could do the consultation on the residential chapter,
right?
because we were doing our residential chapter at the same time. So
So-
that was what we asked them to do.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of like the district plan review, did it include the central city, or was that specifically excluded?
No, it's excluded until stage 2.
Right. So why is the government then saying? And I mean, I don't know who made that call to exclude it. Was that the government's call or our call?
No, it was our call.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, okay. So why? Can you just help me understand why we did that?
It's mainly for legal reasons, to be honest.
There's a few reasons. One of the reasons is the amount of work that needs to happen before you can, that you need to put together in terms of the Section 32 assessments, etc. So that the officers are in a position where they are comfortable to support the proposed plan provisions. From a more legal perspective, were issues, or still are issues with timing. As just mentioned, Sarah is pushing through a review of the living provisions within the central city. In terms of the hierarchy of the relevant provisions, the council cannot do anything that's inconsistent with the central city recovery plan. It's currently being reviewed, so we're essentially waiting for the outcome of that review, because we need the provisions that come through that review before we can notify the chapter. So the timing's not ideal, but we're working to the best that we can with that timing, and that essentially meant a recommendation that the central city move back into phase 2.
Right. Is there any benefit? Would there be any benefit to making any changes now to the central city stuff in light of what the ministers have said? Which, I mean, they're saying that lots of comments on that really, but
Which clause are you referring to?
there's a whole bunch. I mean, 71 draft proposals are clear at hierarchy and type of development. This is what gives effect to the regional land use Christchurch Central Plan. Goes on. Council needs to think carefully about the transition period and how the market will respond in the short term. There's the property groups review, which I presume is not the government, someone else, saying that we should endorse changes to Objective 1 and Policy 1 to explain the role of CCRP and its relationship to the city plan. There's reference to the mixed use zones introduced in the recovery plan, not included in our draft commercial plan. And I guess the telling statement is our view draft commercial proposal should cover the entire district and include commercial zones within the central city.
Okay.
One of the key reasons why I would advise against doing that is the council hasn't consulted on proposed provisions to go through the review, and it essentially hasn't done the work that it needs to do under the RMA to justify those provisions.
So, my understanding was that government did the Central City Recovery Plan, and that includes zoning. So, what is it that we would be doing?
The Central City Recovery Plan doesn't cover everything within the Central City. It only covers some provisions. And it's,
for example, open space.
Yeah, for example, open space. It did address some via designation, but it didn't take a full review of the operative provisions that apply within the 4 avenues. So when we get to phase 2 and the council looks to do it, well, it's already underway, reviewing the provisions that apply within the Central City. It is restricted in terms of what it can recommend because of what's in the Central City Recovery Plan, but that is not the full picture. So there's things like the natural hazards, so some of the wider chapters, contaminated land, those kind of things. The council needs to consider whether they are the most appropriate for within the 4 avenues, and that exercise hasn't been completed yet.
The government's letter says the property group's review of the proposed commercial chapter includes a number of recommended changes to the objectives and policies. Who's the property group, and have their submission been copied to us?
The property group are a planning consultancy, and they were commissioned to undertake an independent review of the commercial and the industrial chapters, and their advice, together with advice from an economist, informed changes to the urban design thresholds that we brought to you on the 5th of June and were approved for sending to the ministers.
So we hired them to
Yes.
do an independent review. Thank you. That's good. Yep. So Jimmy, you're next.
Questions regarding to the industrial area on page 164 and 65. The Islington Park, what is the status of infrastructure constraint?
Sorry, the infrastructure status of
Yes, constraint in here.
Islington Park
Yes.
is under development now. The first stages have been consented by way of subdivision consent, and so there's no immediate infrastructure constraints, and the roading improvements and the upgrades can be undertaken in conjunction with the subdivision, which is well underway.
Okay, but okay. Second question: the Sir James, the Valley Drive. In here, you particularly mentioned the subject to the intersection upgrade, and also mentioned this implemented by developer. So, what's the criteria? Some facility, or infrastructures by council, some facility or infrastructure by the developer. Whether developer new subdivision, they should is through the DC, etc. So what's the difference?
In some cases, infrastructure upgrades can be directly linked with the development, and in this case, the rezoning of land off Sir James Wattie Drive, which is already zoned in the city plan for industrial activities, that has a direct impact on the intersection of Shands Road and Sir James Wattie Drive. And in a lot of greenfield areas like that, both residential and industrial, there's cost sharing agreements. In some cases, council and the developer share costs. In some cases, the developer takes full responsibility for the costs. And in this case, the developer, because of the impact of their subdivision, the costs are borne by the developer.
Okay, so that kind of infrastructure is within the part of the extension of the land, am I right? Because here you mentioned 39 hectares, so it's within the...
It's directly adjacent to the 39 hectares.
Yes.
And the 39 hectares is directly accessible off Sir James Wattie Drive.
Thank you.
Ellie?
I'd like to ask the same question with regards to the industrial areas and the expansion there, as was asked about the residential earlier, because I note that there is quite a lot, again, in the Shirley area, Belfast, those sorts of areas. Again, infrastructure was badly hit. And although I see it as noted around the northwest review, I don't know whether the area is, that's on page 164, sorry, anticipated that upgrades are required to wastewater infrastructure. Again, I'd like to know whether that is something that might change as a result of the optimisation. So it's just bringing together what was asked before with residential now with regards to this.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Yanni?
I'm really intrigued about this commercial chapter, and I just wondered if there's elements of the commercial chapter that we could put in place in the central city. As I drive down Barbados Street and see the site of some of the new buildings going up, it doesn't seem that urban design has played much of a role, if any at all. And given that we've got quite a strong focus from our community about urban design, would it be possible to put in place something sort of in the short term around, you know, some requirements of our commercial chapter to apply across the city, so that we, you know, in the interim time, we actually get a nice built environment rather than a pretty average.
None of that has been through any of the process that every other of the chapters that's to be notified on the 27th. So that would mean it's going in without any, without coming to you first. It would be going in without any community consultation. It won't have been across to the ministers.
Sorry, just at a general level, I thought we'd done quite a lot of work around urban design and commercial zoning. So what
We
haven't
have,
we
but the issue is we haven't looked at it in conjunction with the CCRP. We just can't put the urban design rules for various other commercial centres into the city centre. There needs to be a process it has to go through.
So is there any urban design at the moment in the central city?
There's an urban design requirement for any development within the core of the central city business zone, and there's proposed to be an urban design requirement in the central city mixed use zone, which has been subject to draft amendments consulted on recently. So there is already some urban design requirements, but they're not across the whole of the central city.
So maybe one of our responses to the minister is we need to speed up that process in the mixed use zone. Like they're saying we haven't acted quick enough, but you're saying they've already got work going on. And
the Christchurch Central Development Unit has recently consulted on draft amendments to the central city mixed use zone, or a part of it, should I say, which proposes an urban design requirement. Now that will be subject to a process under the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Act. So the minister could decide to approve those amendments, but that's still in a process being worked through.
I think in our response back we should actually make reference to that, because it seems a bit we're getting attacked for not including things in
I don't think attack's quite the right word.
Can I draw your attention? Can I draw your attention to page 181 of the response, where we actually make a comment about that? So it already is recorded in the officer's recommendations.
Yeah, we still have 3 more speakers to talk about no modification areas.
Yeah. No, only me. You get to take over then. You get to take over at 3 o'clock. So it says a review of the provisions that apply to the central city and the proposed plan is underway as part of stage 2, and council officers have been engaging with CERO officials on this process. All right. So, so are there any other questions around the commercial chapter? I think that there are quite detailed reasons why we're responding in the way that we are, and I think paying particular regard to the statement of expectations. I think that they have, yeah. I mean, it's ironic really, because there's a conflict between some of the the focus on the supporting the central city. So the way that it's talked in terms of the central city, it makes it doesn't really talk about the primacy that's given to the central city in terms of commercial. Yeah. So, but that is something that we are required to have regard to, because it would be inconsistent with our obligations under the LERP if we didn't give that.
Correct. And the RPS.
Yeah, and the RPS, right. So I think that you've described all of the reasons why that would be, why we would be in order to to respond to the minister in the way as proposed.
And you're also happy with the industrial chapter?
Happy.
As discussed, Mark's gone through the commercial and industrial chapter.
Yeah. I think that there's a little bit of nervousness around the reference to the Northwest Review. So because it looks as if that's a done deal, but it's still a proposal.
That's right. The mail site is likely to come through in stage 2. It will be from our point of view. And we will come back with regards to outcomes of further investigation regarding infrastructure in that area and also on the residential.
Yeah.
If the airport's plan change for or designation of that land goes through, would that change the proposal that the mail site would like to do?
The effect of a designation is that it gives the right to the use of that land, and it really gives the requiring authority, the airport, the ability to veto or decline the use of land for what the zoning may permit. So effectively, if land's designated, then the requiring authority has the first, a request has to be made to the requiring authority to get approval. And so effectively it trumps the zoning, for want of a better term. So even if the zoning, let's say, permitted an office and the airport felt the office would compromise the purpose of that designation, then that request would be turned down, potentially.
Phil?